Welcome to the Circuspreneur podcast. I am your host, Shenea Stiletto, and my guest on today's episode of the Circuspreneur podcast is Medieval Times union organizer, Erin Zapcic. Erin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's such a pleasure. I'm so excited to interview you, Erin, about all of your efforts in unionizing. It was quite a journey that I've been following since it started. I've been following you and your story through Huffpost, and I want to tell listeners a little bit about who you are. Erin Zapcic is a writer and actor turned union organizer. She came to California by way of New Jersey. And if you've been to Medieval Times in the last 12 years, there's a good chance you have a photo of her somewhere in your phone. She might make her living with words, either hers or someone else's, but her current passion is the labor movement and toppling corporate greed. Her guilty pleasures include trash TV and cheap wine. You're my kind of gal. Erin, am trying to bring and continue to bring this conversation of unionizing into the circus arts industry. And Medieval Times, there's a lot of crossover there. I've known, people on and off over the years that have worked for Medieval Times. I couldn't say that I have very close friends. But in the performing arts world and in the arts world, a lot of us know each other. And Medieval Times is a really niche environment. It's very similar in the way that the circus arts is very niche. And so, these are environments that are really interesting to people, but also very elusive. They don't have a lot of eyes on them. And most of these environments, like the circus, is not union. And most people are really surprised at that. And so I'd love to hear how you came into working for the Medieval Times. And then we can kind of go from there. But first, I think a bit about your background and initially what got you there. I've obviously been to the Medieval Times. And so I have enjoyed your performances or any of your coworkers' performances over the years. And again, I just want to say that your journey and your story in unionizing is fascinating, and the arc, and then kind of where it stalled and where it stopped kind of abruptly. We were discussing that before you got on to the podcast. And again, teaching and showing how much effort and work goes into organizing, and then also to how even that much work can kind of not help you to achieve that ultimate goal of having that ultimate union status. So thank you again for sharing about your background and what got you into the Medieval Times to begin with.
Sure. So I'm an actor, and I was doing the sort of New York thing from New Jersey, and waiting tables, and really not happy, not really making any progress. And as it turned out, I got laid off from. I was working for my ex-boyfriend's boss as a receptionist for an eye doctor's office, and I got very unceremoniously laid off, and I'd never lost a job before. And I, sort of panicked, and I was like, what do I do? And my mom was the one who suggested, actually. She was like, well, isn't Medieval Times right down the street from you? Why don't you see if they're hiring? I guess taking that one step back, I was, no surprise, a nerdy kid. I loved anything medieval. I remember begging my parents to take me to Medieval Times when they first, so they opened in 1990 and in the New Jersey location. And I just remember being totally enamored with the idea of it, and asking my parents to take us. And, it's not a cheap trip. So we ended up going for my 8th grade graduation. And then it just kind of was this thing. And then I went to school in North Jersey, not far from there. And Medieval Times kind of became the place where you'd go for your friend's birthday or something like that. So it had never occurred to me. And my mom was like, why don't you just see if they're hiring? And so I went over there and I filled out an application, and they hired me on the spot. And it was a very unglamorous beginning. I started as a wench in the gift shop, making $7.50 an hour, but it was more than I would have made on unemployment. So I took the job, and I just remember being there about 2 weeks and thinking to myself, man, I really wish this job paid better, because it's the only job I've ever had that I've actually liked. Like I knew at that point I was not, doing what I was doing, working in retail. Like there was no way I'd be able to afford to keep the job, but it was just sort of like putting a Band-Aid on the problem at the moment. And then not long after that, they offered me the opportunity to cross-train as a bartender because I had bartending experience and I was over 18. And that 25 to 50 bucks in cash every week was enough for me to afford to keep the job. So about a month after that, they asked me if I wanted to be like it was called a lead. It was kind of like a shift supervisor kind of deal. And then shortly after that, or I guess, within the first 6 months of me working at the New Jersey Castle, they like were fully staffed for princesses when I got hired. And then all of a sudden, 3 out of the 4 princesses like left in the span of 2 weeks. And the show cast manager knew I was an actor and was like, so can you go in the show like yesterday? So, so I had about a week's worth of rehearsal and I went into the show. So I joined the show cast within the first 6 months of starting at the Lyndhurst location. And then I kind of did both for a while, both showcast and bartending. And then somewhere along the line, I got asked if I wanted to work in the administrative office as a receptionist. And then I was like helping with the marketing team and group sales. And like I like to say at this point, I've done everything other than sling chicken. Like I really have seen how Medieval Times operates from a number of different angles. And then in 2018, I made the decision to move to Los Angeles to, kind of like do the whole LA thing. So I left the New Jersey location and started out here in California. Now the California Castle is not close to LA by any stretch. So it was really just kind of like, I went there and was like, hey, if you need an extra person in the show cast, I'm really only looking to do like 1 or 2 shows a week, but I still had just so much love in my heart for the show and Medieval Times that like, I wasn't ready to let go of that at that time. So I got hired in the California Castle and I was doing the show there up until about a month and a half ago.
Wow, what a journey. And over 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
You worked there for so long. So you have a lot of skin in the game. Like you said, you really know how the Medieval Times operates from top to bottom and inside and out. So you really, I think, have a very curated perspective of what they do well and what they don't do so well. So what inspired the unionizing effort? What got you to the point? Because I would say the unionizing effort right now in the circus arts industry has mostly started and it was inspired because of the pandemic. However, it is not gone anywhere. It's a lot of conversation, but unfortunately everyone is too afraid, doesn't want to take that risk, maybe doesn't even know where to start. And how to like lay that groundwork. So what was your impetus to say, okay, we need to do something about whatever practices that you felt were going on there that weren't equitable?
So, it's funny because when I worked in the New Jersey Castle, we had a really fantastic GM. She was honestly like one of the best bosses I've ever had. And, you always kind of say like, I don't do this job for the money. Like you come for the fun, you stay for the people. Like it really does kind of become like a family. But you're not being compensated well. Right. And, I really I had a different perspective when I worked in the New Jersey Castle because my GM there really, understood that her hands were tied in terms of how much she could pay the knights. And so she tried to make it up to them in other ways, right? Like always making sure that their gym membership was paid for, always making sure they had healthy meals, like things like, I can't pay you more than 18 bucks an hour, but I'm going to make sure that you don't have to buy food. I'm going to make sure you don't have to pay for your gym membership and that kind of thing. So I I thought that the knights were all just entitled and spoiled for like the first 10 years that I worked at Medieval Times. And then a lot of it really did have to do with the pandemic. When we came back from the pandemic, on a personal note, I had just ended a very a long-term romantic relationship, and my ex-boyfriend did not like medieval times. Did not like that I worked there. Didn't even want me to go back after the pandemic. And he had his own reasons for that. Ironically enough, now of course I like feel the same way he does. But but I met him initially because his brother was a knight, so he had a very different perspective on medieval times. His brother was a knight that I worked with in the New Jersey castle and got injured and ended up having to have back surgery at like 25 years old, and it didn't take. And now he's going to be in pain for the rest of his life. And basically, like, his doctors and the medieval times lawyers had to get together and put a number on the quality of the rest of his life and get paid out. But that took years. So my ex-boyfriend had his own reasons for hating medieval times. But because of that, when he and I were together, I never invested in the relationships at the California castle. And because it was a drive and everything else, I would kind of go on the weekends, do my show and leave. And I never really integrated into the culture there. And after the pandemic, my relationship had ended and I was really kind of feeling very unmoored at the time. And so I threw myself into the thing that felt like home, the thing that felt familiar, and really got involved in the culture at the California castle. And when that happened, I really became aware of some really awful policies and things that were in place at the California castle. The leadership at the California castle leaves a lot to be desired. We had knights who were performing in the show literally taping their shoes together because they refused to buy them new equipment, because they didn't want to spend money. The general managers at Medieval Times are incentivized to run lean because the money that they come in under budget goes in their bonus. So you've got the general manager of the California castle driving around in a BMW convertible. Meanwhile, you've got people that are literally living out of their cars because they can't afford to live in Orange County, California. Like that was like the disparity that was on full display at the California castle. And another sort of dimension to this is the New Jersey castle tried to unionize in 2006 and were defeated. And that was something that I was aware of when I worked in New Jersey. It was something that was sort of like woven into the lore of the New Jersey castle. Like, oh yeah, I remember that time they tried to unionize and everything else. So like there was this history there of everyone's always talked about unionizing, but no one's ever actually done it. So the pandemic happened.
Was that effort done through AGVA, through the same unionized effort that you used this time around, or was it a different union?
I believe it was actually IATSE, and it was only the Knights and the Sound and Lighting Department. Yeah. So
IATSE didn't achieve that either.
Correct.
For some reason. Okay. Did they get as far as you guys did with AGVA?
No, they did not win their union election. They lost by 2 votes. And that was on behalf of some like major union busting that Medieval Times did at the time. I know because I worked in the New Jersey castle and heard the story from a million different people who had no reason to lie to me because I wasn't thinking, nobody was talking about unionizing or anything at the time. These are just stories I've heard from people who were there at the time. What it came down to was Medieval Times made a bunch of promises to the union organizers and flipped them at the last minute. And within 6 months of losing the union election, those organizers were no longer knights. They were sales managers with cushy office jobs and only had to work Monday through Friday, didn't have to put their bodies to hell and back. So weird, right? So, and within a year of that union election, everyone who supported the union was gone. So,
oh dear.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So I was aware of like what we would be up against to a degree. But I was not prepared for what we would be up against once we won the election. So sort of walking that back a bit, so COVID happened, and the New Jersey Castle had a change of management. And from what I understand, it was a bit of a disaster when the New Jersey Castle reopened post-COVID. There were a lot of things that employees were not happy with. So the New Jersey Castle was actually the first one to file for an election. And I had heard about it, but again, it was presented to me in such a way like, well, yeah, they're talking about it, but we always talk about it. And then a couple of my friends sent me screenshots of the Huffington Post article that dropped announcing that New Jersey had filed for their election. And they were like, what do you know about this? And I was like, let me see what I can find out. So it became obvious to me, the amount of people who had reached out to me about it, that there was support for it, and that people were like, wait, we can do this. So I reached out to my dad, who was, he worked for the New Jersey Labor Fed, his last job before he retired. So I was like, I think people are interested in this. Like, I had no idea like what to do. I did like a little bit of Googling, and then I was like, I called my dad. I'm like, walk me through the process. Like, we have to collect cards. We have to get people's actual signatures, but we could like still lose our jobs, right? Like, there's still like, of course, legally they're not supposed to fire you for organizing, but there's not a lot that there's nothing to stop them really until like it's after the fact. Part of the problem that I'm sure we'll get into as this conversation goes on is that the system is not set up to actually protect the workers it's supposed to protect. Everything is reactive. There's nothing proactive. So if Medieval Times caught me with these cards collecting signatures, they wouldn't do anything right there on the spot. But if I was 5 minutes late for my next shift, oh, so sorry, and then there's nothing you can do, no real recourse you can pursue other than to file an unfair labor practice charge, which can take upwards of a year before there's any sort of resolution. And in the meantime, your organizers out of the castle, and any kind of union momentum dies in its tracks. That's ultimately what happened in other castles that were collecting cards. But we ended up being successful because we moved very quickly. So my dad walks me through the process, and I called AGVA. As it turns out, the AGVA office in LA is literally like a 5-minute drive from my apartment. So
synchronistic.
Yeah, like literally it's on the same road. I can drive past it all the time. So,
and can you break down, Erin, what AGVA means for those that are unfamiliar with that? Because I know that we know it very well, but what does AGVA represent? Because they also represent a very important component of the circus arts industry that I'd like to get into as well. But please let us know, what does that stand for?
Sure. The AGVA is the American Guild of Variety Artists. And notably, especially for this podcast, they have many of the Cirque du Soleil contracts in New York. I don't know if they have any in Vegas, but I do know
but they have represented some performers on Broadway. When Cirque did Broadway, they represented a few of the artist contracts there. But in the entirety, not much outside of that.
Yeah. Some Broadway shows, the Radio City Rockettes, all of the performers at Disneyland and Universal Studios here in California. So, of course, that was the performers in New Jersey were the ones who made the choice to go with AGVA. And I actually didn't find out until all of this started to fall apart in California that Actors Equity was their first call. And at that time, Actors Equity felt that they did not have the resources to support. They had only just created their organizing division, and they felt that they did not have the resources to support a fight against Medieval Times, knowing what fight they had put up in 2006. So they made the reference to AGVA. And in a lot of ways, AGVA was a much better fit because AGVA tailors each contract to the location. So even the New Jersey castle versus the California castle, our proposed collective bargaining agreements differed in a number of areas. So, even if they were not looking to do a national contract or anything like that, like they were, we're tailoring the contract to each location. And in theory, that should have worked really well. But of course, medieval times being who they are, it did not. So
dear.
we met with AGVA. At that time, I just happened to be the first person they called back, but at that time I didn't know it. My counterpart, Jake Bowman, had also called and was, trying to find out information. But at that stage, everything is so sensitive that they have to kind of vet every person who reaches out. So I just remember the funny thing is that, sorry, go ahead.
Because could it kind of be someone trying to get in there, kind of undercover from medieval times? Do they do things like that? Like if they're reaching out to AGVA, like, oh, we're the union organizers, but it's really medieval times.
Oh,
trying to union bust. Yeah,
for sure. Like sniffing around, saying like, hey, like, has anyone from California like tried to call and get cards yet, or anything like that? So Jake had already called, and Suzanne had said to me, she's like, do you know who Jake Bowman is? And I was like, no, which is like, it's like so weird to me now. It's like, I don't go like more than a day without talking to Jake ever. But at the time, like I really didn't know him. And so he and I connected, and, we talked about what we were going to do. And then we put together like a small group of people that we trusted to start collecting cards. And we collected our cards in 5 days. So, which if anyone has ever done any kind of organizing effort, like you understand like how monumental that is. Like it speaks to how much people wanted this, because like legally, you only need 30% of your proposed bargaining unit to sign cards to call for an election. But most unions will not begin the process until they believe you have what they call a supermajority of cards. So like more than 51%, let's say. So we were able to do that in just 5 days. So the New Jersey Castle had their election on Friday, July 15th. And on that following Monday, we filed our cards for the election. So we were like, we're sending a message, we're doing this. And honestly, like I said, that's the only reason a second election happened, because after that, there were other castles that were collecting cards. There were at least 3 other castles collecting cards at one point. And Medieval Times really got in there and started promoting people, giving raises, paying someone's rent, I heard at one point. Having their captive audience meetings and firing people, in some instances, firing union organizers. And it really like just stopped everything in its tracks. Any kind of union momentum stopped in its tracks. And they also dragged out our election. So in New Jersey, the election happened in 6 weeks. And since then, the NLRB has made some new rulings that shortens that timeline even more. But at the time, 6 weeks was about as quick as an election can happen, because the first thing that happens is that you file for voluntary recognition. And then, in I don't know what the actual statistic is, but in a very small number of cases, the employer will say okay, we acknowledge the fact that you want a union, so we're going to skip the election. We're going to acknowledge the union, and we'll go straight to the bargaining table. That happens basically never, but that's the first. But that's the first thing.
Does that happen?
It does. It does occasionally. Ben and Jerry's notably gave voluntary recognition to their union because they actually stand by their progressive values. Yeah.
If you know the owners, then it makes sense.
Yeah. So
by the track record,
they're very good to their union employees. I believe there was another one in the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art voluntarily recognized their employee union. They did have to go on strike a little while ago, but they came to they were only on strike for a couple of weeks, and then they were able to get their agreement. So so that's good. But yeah, but basically never does an employer voluntarily recognize the union. So
Is there a
then,
reason why the NLRB like kept that 6 week gestation period all these years and all this time without recognizing that probably wasn't the best way?
well, the problem is that the NLRB is a federal agency, which means that
Mm-hmm.
every time there's a change in administration, there is a change in the people who run the NLRB. So
Got
right
it.
now, we have a very progressive, very union-friendly general counsel for the NLRB named Jennifer Abruzzo, who's amazing and has, especially in the last like year and a half, 2 years, has managed to secure some new policies at the NLRB that have helped a lot in terms of in terms of the union election process and things like that. Like case in point,
Mm-hmm.
there was a very recent ruling that it's called the CMEX decision, and it's if an unfair labor practice is committed by an employer during the election process, it bypasses the election and goes straight to the bargaining table. So the reason that's
Brilliant.
important is because many employers, medieval times included, commit huge labor law violations during the election process. And what that happens is that poisons the well. So so anyone who like isn't aware enough or savvy enough to understand that like the intimidation, like these are all just tactics from the employer, and that's why you need a union more than like it takes a lot of like chutzpah to say like to recognize what's happening and go, yeah, this is why we need a union, not I'm worried about what's going to happen if I don't go along with the company. Like you'd
Right.
think people would understand that a
Yes.
union is protection, and all they're doing is showing us even more reason why we need a union. But
Yes.
intimidation works. That's the reality of it. So,
So is she on
um,
a term limit, or is she only with respect to which administration is in office? Is her position subject to term limits, and then she has to kind of get reelected, or she gets appointed to that position for a certain amount of time?
she gets appointed. That's a presidential appointment, I believe.
Mm.
So,
So elections do matter, and
yes,
voting does matter.
absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah. A nice
And
reminder of that.
yeah, for sure. And I have seen firsthand the
Mm-hmm.
impact of a Trump NLRB. Like again, it's a whole conversation for a whole other thing, but related to the topic at hand, our
Yes.
election, what Medieval Times did was they contested our bargaining unit. They didn't in New Jersey. So you file your cards, you file for voluntary recognition, and the company doesn't acknowledge it, right? So then a hearing is set to determine the appropriateness of the bargaining unit. Our bargaining unit was exactly the same as it was in New Jersey: the stables department, knights department, and showcast department. They didn't contest it in New Jersey. They contested it in California. Apparently, you can't point to what happened in New Jersey and say they didn't have a problem with it there. Apparently, that's not enough of an argument. I don't know. So,
Hmm.
so they contested it in California, which meant that we went to a hearing.
Hmm.
And then the hearing had to be decided on by the NLRB, which is understaffed and underfunded. And that meant that our election couldn't happen until they made a decision about our bargaining unit. And that took 4 months. And it took 4 months
Hmm.
because of a pilot program introduced during the Trump administration, where the regional director who heard the hearing was not the regional director that made the ruling. Why? I don't know. Why are any of that man's policies still in place? But so because of that pilot program, our election took 4 or 5 months. And in the
How
meantime,
hurtful.
we're sitting there captive audience meetings every week. At one point, the person that they sent to us from the corporate office to hold these captive audience meetings introduced the idea of getting us to withdraw our petition for election entirely, basically saying, if you cancel your election, you can file for a new election in 6 months. You can even use the same cards. That's the hardest part, is collecting the cards. First of all, that is wildly inaccurate, because if you try to submit for another petition for election with the same cards, like, yes, your cards are valid a year from the date that you sign them, right? You have a year from the time you start collecting cards to the time you can submit them. But all of the cards are reviewed by the NLRB when you submit them. So if we tried to file for a new election using the exact same cards we used for an election that we ended up canceling, like, how is the NLRB going to say, like, yes, you can use those cards? Because that could just be the union saying, like, we want a new election and we're just going to refile those cards. But they don't present any of that information. They just start saying, like, you can use the same cards. You can work with the company directly for 6 months. And if you aren't happy with the things you see in the next 6 months, then you can file for a new election using the same cards. It's like putting the whole thing on pause. That's what they kept saying. They kept calling it a pause. It was wildly misleading. And because of that whole thing, we filed an unfair labor practice charge ahead of the election. That's not something that it's typically done ahead of an election. This was, before the CMEX decision, because it's politics. And this is the thing that's, like, weird to me, because I certainly did not get involved with this to get into politics, but I'm just talking about politics in the general sense here, not like the policy, but it's, like, running any group, there's politics involved, right?
Right.
So in terms, from an internal politics standpoint, an internal organizing standpoint, typically ULPs, unfair labor practices, are not filed against an employer during an election process, because you don't know if you are, if you don't win the election, then the union is, like, taking on these legal costs for people that they don't represent. But B, from a politics standpoint, the company is going to turn around and spin it like this is just desperation from the union, blah, blah, blah. So despite the fact that there were many other unfair labor practices that Medieval Times committed during our election, we just kind of had to, like, let it happen. And
that's so hard.
Say anything. Yeah, exactly.
How hard.
Because of these internal politics issues. But this situation was so bad that we filed the unfair labor practice charge, and we ended up winning. We had so much evidence that the company was involved in it. Like, legally, the company is not supposed to be involved in your election whatsoever. Like, they can say to you, like, this is why we think that you shouldn't vote for the union, but they cannot, like, be that involved in your election. So I say all of this because a year later, we would have been able to bypass our election and go straight to the bargaining table with a bargaining order if that had happened post CMEX decision. But because of the timing of it, we didn't see any benefit from that. And in the meantime, we still obviously ended up winning the election, and it was fine. But that was the first real instance of, and this is sort of the thing that I kind of want to drive, the overall thing that I kind of want to drive home with this conversation was the first indication of being failed by the system, because we were failed by every system that we put our faith in at the national level with the NLRB, and ultimately at the local level, which was sort of the last nail in the coffin, which I'll get to when we get there, by local officials. The organizing effort, the system, is actually not in favor of the workers, and especially not when you don't have a pro-union administration like we currently have.
Yes. And, I actually had a presidential candidate, Jason Palmer, on the podcast, and I was discussing that with him, and he was discussing about how outdated the labor laws are and the
Mhm.
unionizing laws are. He's like, these are laws from like the 1950s,
Yeah.
and it's unfair to put workers, to hold workers to those very old, outdated laws. And also, too,
Mhm.
I think it also comes into play of having more officials that are from our backgrounds, that are from our demographics as well, that understand these environments and that I think are going to be voicing opinions and fighting for things in a very different way if they're from backgrounds that are similar to ours. But I mean, I don't know how you feel about that, but to me, it's for myself, it's encouraging individuals from our environment. Like for you, example, Erin, I mean, the next thing I would expect you to do is to run for office because look how much you have learned. Yes, I know. And, so,
Yeah.
and that's the thing that comes back to environments like ours. People laugh at us. They laugh when they think about medieval times unionizing or the circus arts unionizing. They laugh at all of us. Or
Mhm.
they look at SAG-AFTRA and the actors and they think like, oh, everyone's making millions and millions and millions of dollars. Why do they need a union? They don't understand the protections that you need. They don't understand, what we're facing now with technology, how these contracts have changed with streaming, all of those things. And then they never think about the reach, the vast reach of who's like at the bottom, who's in the middle, and then who's at the top, and how you
Mhm.
need to have different protections for all of those people that are involved. But I think, you would be a brilliant person to run for office, to run from some office where you can actually influence things on this type of level, because look at all the things that you've learned and all the knowledge that you have. And
Yeah.
then not only that, you have the experience of actually being in that environment as an actor, as an employee, and instead of someone that's coming into this that maybe, has a lot of experience with politics or has a lot of engagement working with the NLRB or something of that nature, but has never felt what it feels like when you are in these environments and treated inequitably. I mean, it just changes everything for you after that. And the fact that you can see all of the different protections that you just don't have, and looking at that in a broader sense and looking at in the way that other environments are historically very represented. No one says that about any of the other historically represented environments or, labor movements in America. But then when it comes to the arts and culture, everyone thinks like, why do you need that? Or, oh, you don't have that. It's either surprising. I mean, like they have something for UFC now in Las Vegas where they came in, they organized diligently, they have the money, which that was another question I wanted to ask you. How expensive is it for a union to do organizing? Like how much of a budget do they need to be able to provide for that? Because I know we also discussed, when you guys went on a strike and you GoFundMe, about 1 or 2 months worth of money to be able to sustain, because that's another difficult thing as well. Again, people are going to say, we won't have money. How are we going to make money? How are we going to support ourselves through this? And again, you guys were like renegades at that. But I wanted to understand that what that amount of money looks like, so that individuals interested in that understand like kind of what they're up against, when you said that the Actors Equity didn't feel like they were up to the task to be able to support you guys financially.
Yeah, financially, it's a huge undertaking, and a lot of it is legal fees. To be quite honest,
Okay.
The AGVA told us at the when we were sort of having our like wrap up goodbye conversations that they spent over $500,000 in legal fees in
Oh
1 year.
God.
In
Oh
1 year.
my God. Oh my
Between
God.
all of the ULPs, between the Medieval Times sued us, by the way, that they sued us right before our election for trademark infringement because we called ourselves Medieval Times Performers United. And so they claimed that, we were profiting off of their trademark and everything else. So there was that lawsuit that they had to defend. And then, there's also just the very real costs of bargaining a first contract. That's just legal fees. And, that's not talking about just the cost of things like just my personal costs of like running flyers, printing flyers off at Staples to give out to thousands of people crossing our picket line every single day. Just having snacks, having like, things of like being able to get our friends together when we're not on strike to keep people like to keep people engaged and to fight apathy and like try to keep the morale up and everything else. And just personally, my wine budget like tripled while I was on strike.
As it should have.
Yeah. So I will say that most fights are not like ours. And if Agva spent over $500,000 while we were on strike, Medieval Times spent 5 times that much. I'm certain of it, because they were flying in scabs from every other castle across the country, including Canada, where they didn't have work visas and we got them turned away at the border. But they gave everyone huge 20% plus raises after our election. So everyone they were flying in from other castles were getting already paid more money than we were if we hadn't gone on strike. They were getting free airfare, free hotel rooms, daily bonus, weekly per diems. That's just what they were spending on the scabs. That's not including the amount of money they spent on digital advertising. From the day we went on strike to the day we went back to work, I could not open Instagram without getting flooded with Medieval Times ads. I have not seen a single one since we made the unconditional offer to return to work. Now, at this point, I've like unfollowed everything. But from the time we went back to work, I've not seen a single Medieval Times ad. So they were and giving discounts and the amount of people that chose not to cross our picket line and get refunds, where Medieval Times doesn't typically offer refunds. It costs a lot of money, to get back to your original question. It costs a lot of money to organize, and hopefully you have a union that, or you have a bargaining representative that is willing to take that on and take those fights on. But it does cost a lot of money, but you can also cost your employer a lot of money as well. That's the only upside. Yeah.
I was going to say, at least you guys cost them so much money in that fight. I mean, at the very least. And they also had you guys banned on TikTok for a certain amount of time, right? They shut down your TikTok account. Oh, still.
Yeah. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. That was ultimately why we went out on strike, because we had only been using the platform for about a month, and we had over 8,000 followers, and we were being very vocal on social media about how our bargaining was going. So the first thing that happened after our election was the company offered us the opportunity. I say that legally they had to offer us the opportunity to bargain for our annual raises. Like, raises happen at the end of the year, every year, more so for knights because they get promoted depending on their performance reviews. But legally, they were obligated to offer us the opportunity to bargain for these raises. So, and at that point, we were hearing what I had already mentioned, that the other castles around the country, all the non-union castles, were getting huge raises, upwards of 20%. And when we sat down to make our initial proposals, which literally were like, pay us the cost of living in Southern California, which is $25 an hour to start, their initial wage proposal to us was something like a 2% wage increase for some job titles, 0% for other job titles. And then they didn't even bring the Knights promotions info we had asked for like weeks in advance. So we were very vocal about that on social media, and Medieval Times didn't like that very much. So they used that bogus trademark infringement lawsuit to get us kicked off of TikTok. And we are still not on the TikTok. I mean, at this point, it doesn't matter, but yeah, we never got that account back. And that could have made a huge difference for us while we were on strike, because, you know, every single day, all we heard over and over again, oh my God, I had no idea. If I had known, I wouldn't have bought tickets. I mean, part of that is just people trying to make themselves feel better. There's no excuse for crossing a picket line, full stop. Especially not when there's Pirates Dinner Theater 2 doors down, Knott's Berry Farm across the street, Disney 10 minutes away. You mean to tell me there's literally nothing else you can do with your time than go to Medieval Times? Like, oh, I'm here with my kids. Then do your job as a parent and explain it to them. They're going to work someday. Where do you think your 40-hour work week came from? Where do you think you here on vacation? Where do you think your paid vacation came from? Like, you're celebrating a holiday weekend. Where do you think that holiday came from? Like, these are things that like people don't understand in terms of
came from unions.
Yeah, the history of organized labor in this country. And the problem is that union busting, and we're going to get into the political conversation, but politics and policies have been systematically chipping away at the power of unions since the 50s and 60s, and especially with this, propaganda effort of, like for the brief period of time that, yes, the mob ran the Teamsters and whatever, like that's not the reality of organized labor in this country anymore. But so many people have that in their heads that they think, they just hear union, like, oh, it must be bad. It's like, well, where do you think the middle class went? The middle class went away with the disintegration of unions and the systematic stripping of their powers in the last 5-6 decades.
Right. And relating that to our niche, unique environments. And I think that's the brilliant thing that you're pairing that with. And another thing that you spoke about, Erin, we were discussing how long you guys picketed and were without work and without a payment. And just to reflect on, SAG-AFTRA, how long, people were losing their homes. Nobody was getting any kind of contracts. I had friends that were personally affected by that strike. It was so damaging. And then at the very last minute, they got this bill passed that gave everybody unemployment. And then a month later or so, they had an agreement on the books. And it was like, wow, you couldn't have done that any sooner. It was like great, but it was devastating. And we discussed the fact that there was a bill that Governor Newsom could have signed to, because I wasn't sure if that had ever been a policy or not, or how it was introduced, and if they were just doing like an emergency protective order for SAG-AFTRA during those negotiations. But you tell a very key, interesting component of what could have supported you all in your union strike, and what could have supported more workers to unionize in the future, and what may deter them from unionizing in the future without, having access to what he basically vetoed.
Yes. So there was a bill on his desk to provide unemployment benefits to people who are on strike, and he ultimately vetoed it. I honestly don't recall if he made any kind of official statement about it, but the general gist of it is that he has his eye on the White House, and he is afraid of being seen as too progressive. Like, already coming from California, people are going to be like painting him as the wildly progressive candidate. And it's like, okay, well, we need that. Like, let my personal politics show for a second. The Democrats need to stop chasing the moderate Republicans and start fostering their progressive base. They think that people are just going to continue to vote blue no matter who. And like, this is another failure of the systems that are supposed to protect workers. Now, the reality is most strikes do not last as long as ours did. Ours lasted for 9 months. We lasted long. We were on strike before WGA and SAG-AFTRA, and we were on strike after WGA and SAG-AFTRA both had their contracts. Most strikes don't last that long. And I know it was an unprecedented strike for WGA and SAG-AFTRA. And really, once WGA had their agreement, SAG-AFTRA was shortly thereafter. But the law is not set up to protect long strikes. And this is ultimately one of the reasons why we had to call off our strike and go back to work. So the entire time we were on strike, Medieval Times was actively hiring new people to replace us. Now, that's illegal on an unfair labor practice strike. But again, there's no NLRB police that you can call and say, hey, Medieval Times is violating labor law. You need to get in there and stop it. You have to let it happen so that you can document it and then file an unfair labor practice about it and wait for the NLRB to take a year to do something about it, right? So they were hiring replacements and telling us that they were temporary, which is legal for them to hire temporary workers, but they were telling the people they were hiring that they were permanent. Like, every time our attorneys said, we know you're hiring people. Legally, you're supposed to provide us with their contact information because we represent them. They're union performers if you're hiring them at your location. And they kept saying, well, they kept trying to say that they were temporary and that, that we didn't have jurisdiction over them because they were temporary. And then we were coming up on a year from our election certification, which meant that we were vulnerable to decertification. And what that means is that if you have 30% of the bargaining unit that is unsatisfied with the progress of things so far, they can call for a new election. And all it takes is 30% to file this petition for a new election. So based on the people that didn't ever go out on strike with us and the people that we knew they were hiring while we were on strike, we knew that we were very likely going to face decertification. However, what we did not know was that our outstanding unfair labor practices would not be enough to get that decertification dismissed. So our attorneys sort of advised us like, hey, you've got this narrow window here while Medieval Times is still saying that their new hires are temporary. But at any time they could turn around and say, just kidding, these people are permanent. And then you wouldn't be able to vote in your own decertification election. So so we sort of had to like scramble to go back to work. But my point of going into this whole story is that we were like, well, can't we just say that like we can prove or try to prove that they hired permanent replacements while we were on an unfair labor practice strike? And we were advised by our attorneys that the NLRB does not look favorably on protracted strikes that go on for however long. Like at some point they're going to look at this and say like, well, you lost. So, even if you call this an unfair labor practice strike, like there was going to be no end to this strike. So, that's, you're kind of shit out of luck. Sorry, I don't know if I can swear, but that's so.
Yes, you can. After everything you've been through, you can say whatever you want.
So
you stuck it to medieval times. So
yeah. So that's another way that the system does not actually protect these workers, because rather than looking at this and saying like, hey, Medieval Times, your employees have been on strike for 9 months. Why don't you try to reach an agreement with them? Because in 9 months, never once did they come to us and say, how do we get you guys to come back to work? Never once did they come to us and say, how do we end this strike? Even you look at the cartoon villains that were the motion picture producers, you look at, or the AMPTP, the acronym was escaping me. You look at the cartoon villains of the AMPTP, even they at some point realized we're bleeding money. This is not a good look for us. Let's just suck it up and reach an agreement. Medieval Times never did that. Never once said to us, how do we get you to come back to work?
Unbelievable.
Never intended to. Their intention was to exploit the system that is skewed in their favor and just wait us out. And that's exactly what happened.
So it ended. And so where do you go from here? So AGVA basically came out and said, okay, we're no longer representing this initiative. And so where does all of that go, Erin? Where does all of that hard work go? Where does that whole mission go? And everything that AGVA put behind that, is that kind of held in trust for you to re-engage with that fight again if any castle chooses to do that in the future? Can it also to be transferred to another union to take that on? Like where do you go from here? Where does that fight how does that fight evolve into different hands? Because that was just so disappointing with everything that you're up against. I think it's fascinating, and it also goes to show as well within the arts and in our environments how disposable these environments and these entities think that we are. And that's what's so sad. People say, oh, you guys are so amazing. You're so talented. You're so incredible. Look at all the things that you're doing. And the entire time as well, we all know how disposable we are. We know that they feel that they can just replace us with whoever, and that anyone is willing to go into that space, to be treated in that way, to get a few little perks here and there, and then to have a little bit of catnip, have a little bit of a carrot held in front of them, and then they'll stay and they'll work for way less. I continue to say, why haven't our wages increased over the last 20 years in this environment? Because there's no one there fighting and saying that they should. I mean, people are still offering me the same money that they offered me 20 years ago. And where is the person to defend that? And these are conversations that no one realistically wants to have in this circus industry or in the arts, of how awful that is, that everyone else is becoming millionaires and these environments keep changing and evolving, and how many more billionaires are there, and how much more money does the Medieval Times have, how much more money does a company like Cirque du Soleil have, but the rates of your workers and your employees has stalled. Unless maybe you're, for example, the only ones represented by a union are the riggers in the circus. They're represented by I think IATSE, from what I understand and what I know, and there's difficulties in and around that because they are like alone. They're just existing on their own with no one kind of challenging them. I always say the problem with that union is the fact that there's not another union, the people that they're flying in the air, that have that representation to kind of go against them. So there's, the conversations are very, kind of multifaceted and multi-layered. We just don't have any container with which to hold them within. So my perspective, and, coming to a close of the podcast, thank you so much, Erin, for giving just all of this time to the podcast and all of this knowledge. And, you're just absolutely brilliant, and you've just been through so much. And I just think that you're a renegade and a rebel, and I know that this is going to come and it's going to create some change. It already has. I mean, obviously everything that it created and shifted that narrative, if it happened in 2006, then it happens again, how many years later, and then it happens how many years later as well, and being a success ultimately. But I know that was kind of a long-winded question to kind of close this out. And then I also wanted to ask you to close this out, and what advice you would give to the circus arts industry in terms of unionizing, and what you learned and what you think you would have done differently throughout this time, and your experience with being an organizer.
Sure. So the first question, where do we kind of go from here? I mean, the thing of it is, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, I have left Medieval Times. It was not an easy. It was an easy thing to do based on the way they treated us. But I guess I should say, when we went back to work in November, when we called off the strike and we went back to work, we were dealing with relentless harassment, relentless retaliation. The guys, the knights that went back to work, as far as I know, they are still not performing in the show. Like legally, the company is supposed to return us to our pre-strike jobs within a certain amount of time. They started the guys on this like training regiment, like they had never worked a day in their lives. We had people who had worked over a decade being a knight. They were in the horse stalls shoveling shit like they had just been hired the day before. And as a result, between the fact that, we called off the strike kind of very quickly and the way they were treated when we went back to work, we lost a lot of people. Like a lot of people just ended up giving up and quitting. So in terms of Medieval Times, there's really not anything left for me to fight for at this point. In terms of me personally, where does the fight go? Like, where does all of this energy and, I'm still sort of figuring out my future. I know organized labor is going to be a part of it. Here in California, you do not have to go to law school to take the bar. So I'm very seriously considering, we do have an infrastructure set up for it. It's like a work-study apprenticeship program.
Baby bar.
You take the baby bar first and then the whole bar. It's a whole thing. So I am very seriously considering leveraging my now new network of labor attorneys to see if they'd be willing to sponsor me to go through the program and try and become a labor attorney. I would really love to fight for unions and help them get the contract that we were ultimately not able to. A lot of that, to be perfectly frank, is dependent on the outcome of this election in November, because with the current state of the NLRB and even having a very pro-union presidency. If we see a Trump presidency again in November, to me personally, sorry to offend anyone, to me it would be a disaster for a number of reasons, but certainly to me would spell the end of organized labor as we know it in this country. So I might be catastrophizing. Like I'm actually in a couple weeks. I don't know when this is going to air, but I'm headed to the Labor Knows conference in Chicago in a couple weeks. I've been asked to speak on a panel there, and really, I'm just excited.
Good for you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. I'm really I decided to go to this conference because I want to talk to more people that are actually in it and who have weathered different administration changes and what people in labor are thinking about this election, because even election aside, you've currently got Starbucks, SpaceX, Amazon, and Trader Joe's trying to get the NLRB ruled unconstitutional. And if this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, I am very concerned. So, So as much as I'd love to say that, I am 1000% guns blazing, going to start, working as a labor attorney in the next 5 years, I honestly, there's still so much up in the air in terms of just the state of this country and the state of organized labor in this country that I'm just sort of watching and seeing how things unfold before I make a clear decision about where my future is with organized labor. But I'm hopeful that I have a future in organized labor, but not really sure where I stand at the moment. And then in terms of what I learned, what I would have done differently, what I want to warn people about in terms of organizing, Medieval Times was its very own beast in that they are a privately held company and they are not accountable to shareholders. So you look at some of the really big labor fights we see right now, Starbucks, Amazon, Trader Joe's, those are all publicly traded companies that are very image conscious. And Medieval Times made it clear that they didn't give a shit about how people thought about them. They've made it clear that they think that their audience is too dumb to notice a change in the quality of the show, because in my opinion, the quality of the show has declined considerably and is continuing to decline. They literally trained people who got hired after we went out on strike and were doing champ in the show less than a year later. They're literally they're training people very quickly. They're not taking into consideration a lot of safety things. And I don't know, maybe they're going to sue me next, but I feel like they have, in my opinion, and my opinion does not reflect the, opinions and strategies and whatever of Medieval Times. I don't work there anymore. Who cares? But, I have seen a sharp decline in the quality of the show. I think that they think people are just going to continue to give them money, and so they don't care. But I say that as a word of caution for your efforts in the circus industry, because I imagine it is a similar situation where it's not a publicly traded company, and if they have a lot of money to burn, they may very well burn it, because it wasn't enough to beat us. They wanted to destroy us. They wanted to treat us like a dog that shat in the middle of the floor and rub our noses in it. That's the way we were treated. Now, I don't know what the management is like in your company. This was a very personal fight. It became very personal and very petty. I'm not who, Joe Organizer at Starbucks is to Howard Schultz. I know he's not the CEO anymore, but in terms of something like that, those organizers are like numbers on a spreadsheet. I know the CEO of Medieval Times. I knew him for 10 years before we even started organizing, like that. It became a very personal, very ugly, very emotionally draining fight. So I guess the only thing I would say is, like, organizing is always worth it because you establish for yourself and for your peers that you are worth more. You are worth being treated with respect. Ultimately, we lost so many people. We lost our fight because people were unwilling to put up with the disrespect we were getting thrown at us when we went back to work. Like, it wasn't worth it for them anymore, especially once they started working in other jobs where they're making more money. Like, why am I going to go back to a job that treats me like garbage so that I can be a knight in a show? Like, that was the only thing they were dangling in front of us, is like, well, you get to be a performer at Medieval Times. And it's like, okay, cool. But like, a lot of people also see us as the butt of the joke. So you're going to treat me like garbage and pay me like garbage so that people can laugh at me. Like, but I'm sort of like getting away from the plot here. But, organizing tells your employer, you can't treat me like this anymore. And
yes.
Even if ultimately your situation ends up the way ours did, none of us is being treated like that anymore.
And
right
on.
So that's, organizing gave us that. And so, yes, it's going to be a hard fight. And I certainly hope that the circus does not put up anywhere near as much of a fight as Medieval Times put up against us, because you all deserve to be treated like professionals, to have safety protocols in place. Like, what y'all do is dangerous, the same as with us. Everyone deserves a basic standard of protection in the workplace. And for a company to turn around and say no, I mean, like, that's really what it came down to. Like, we said to Medieval Times, treat us with respect, and Medieval Times said no. Like, that's really, like, yeah, exactly.
We think everything is fine.
Yeah, exactly. Like, how can you be so disloyal to the company after all we've done for you?
Yes. Yes.
So I think, just as long as you stay true to knowing your worth, knowing your value, and not backing down, even if the fight ends up like ours did, you're still in a better place than where you started.
Thank you so much, Erin, and totally agreed. I think that you are just so incredibly brave and amazing, and I'm just so grateful that you dedicated your life to making it your mission to unionizing the medieval times. Like, thank you so much, from that type of niche environment, from the performing arts, to go and put yourself through that, because not everybody has the courage to do that. People can be so afraid and want to stay with the status quo, and it takes someone like you, who's a renegade and a rebel, to move like that conversation, that narrative forward, and then helps for the next generation to be able to do even more. I mean, if no one's willing to take on that task, then nothing will ever change. And I love that you weren't just about talking, you put action into changing, because a lot of these environments, we can get very caught up in conversation and just constantly complaining about what we don't like about this industry. And you really just put your money where your mouth was, and you decided to I think you gave up your whole career. You invested over a decade in this company, and you loved it, just like we love the circus. Whenever I say, to people, it's like, I love my career. I love my job. I have given this my life. It's a lifestyle being in medieval times. I know that. It's a lifetime being in the circus arts. So, for any individual to kind of degrade that and say that maybe we're ungrateful in those ways, this is not a family. It is your job.
It is your job.
you have rights on purpose. These are not ultimately your friends. And some of them may be, which is beautiful. But if they're not willing to voice for you and to be able to change the narrative while also staying in a better position over you, that's not right. That's not right. You should have power. You should have the power to negotiate on your behalf. And it's not right for you to just feel that you are flashy and famous and cool. Like that doesn't pay anyone's bills. It doesn't give anyone an employment. It doesn't give anyone workers' comp. It doesn't give you a pension, and it doesn't give you a retirement. And these environments should not be able to source millions and billions of dollars for themselves while people go broke and stay homeless, just all in service of the love of what you're doing. I don't think that in the arts we can sustain on that anymore. And I think that the pandemic showed us that, but your guys' valiant effort with the Medieval Times really showed that. Like, it was just absolutely brilliant. And again, thank you so much, Erin, for taking the time to be on the podcast and for explaining all of that language. It's, it's intricate. And for those that are not very familiar with unionizing, especially in the arts world and in the entertainment world, thank you for breaking that down and for making it consumable so that we can understand it, because it's a lot. And I can only imagine, and I wish only good things for you. And I will continue to say I support any campaigning effort that you are going to put forth. I think you need to run for office, okay? Like pass the baby bar, whatever. But I think that you should run for office so that the first thing that you do when you get into office is to make all of these different, kind of policies and decisions around companies like that, and holding them accountable. And I hope that more of the people that were involved in your unionizing effort also too get into politics, to be able to change the narrative. Because I think also too, we see people all the time running for office and we just don't say like, oh, why not me? And I think that within the arts, it's a time for us to all have a seat at those tables instead of being like from the outside in. Like, we need to be in there to change that, because we're going to be at, we are at the, what is that called? At the mercy of these laws that really, really, impact the rest of our lives and the rest of our careers, and then everybody that's coming, after us. And I don't think that, all of this effort and everything that people have put forth to see these environments getting worse, it just really breaks my heart, when things should be getting better, but the quality of things is getting so much worse for the actual performer and artist and worker. So thank you so much again. And I will close out this podcast by saying the Circuspreneur podcast is also available on Circus Talk, now Stage Link, the inclusive, independent, and international online network for the circus industry. Stage Link's mission is to create a level playing field for this industry and democratize access to information. Until next time, everyone, please stay safe and stay healthy. I'm your host, Shenea Stiletto.